Hi, it's Jackie from Spare Room Studio here. I've been asked a few times how I use my Faber Castell Connector Pens, and I thought that it was time to get brave and actually try to do a video. So please bear with me. I'm a little bit nervous. Like everyone else, you don't like to hear your own voice. So here we go, let's give it a try. So to start with, I just use the pen on the paper there. So I use the darker colour first, and then I get the lighter colour and just overlap that and bring that in. If there are any pen marks or streaks, you can use a water brush to smooth those out. Now some colours are a little bit more easy to dilute than others. As you can see, I haven't really got a lot of colour come off of that one there. But that's another way that you can use them, is that you can colour onto the paper and then using a water brush, or any brush really, but just using the water to pick up some of the excess colour and then paint with it. You can also do some dots and then bring in the lighter colour. Well, actually, although it's lighter on the barrel, it's not showing lighter on the paper. So that's dots, and then you can use the water to ever so slightly blend those together. I apologise for the planes going over. I never time these things right. Okay, so that's another way that you can use it, or you can do the dots and only do dots is another way to blend colours. Or I have found that sometimes when you do that, it's actually nice to then use one of the colours to smush them together and blend them in together. It is best to wait and let that dry now before doing too much more, otherwise it may bleed through on the other side. So we might do that and come back to it in a little while. Next I'll have a go with, these are the Derwent watercolour pencils. I've had these for, I'd have to say, at least 20 years now, and as you can see, they're showing a little bit of wear and tear. But of course the leads or pigment is still fine in them. And what I like to do with those is I can pick up the colour from the tip of the pencil and then paint onto dry paper. I'll just brush that off on a piece of paper towel. I can wet the whole thing, and that is rather wet. Pick up some colour from the pencil and then drop that colour into the wet areas and just let it bleed. Then I can pick up a second colour and introduce that second colour into there and just let that bleed on its own, which is totally unpredictable and you don't know quite how that's going to end up. You can of course keep moving it around by, pushing the colour here and there with your brush. I do find that can become very overworked very quickly. So it's best to just let that dry now. Another way to work could be wetting that first, then around the dry edges put a bit of colour and just gently push it into the wet area and let the colour bleed and do its own thing. Sometimes I find that the colour might look a bit too solid. So for example, so we've got that colour there and there's not a lot of variation in the tone of the colour there. So then I might just squeeze the water brush and have a drop of water and let that drop into the middle, and that's now just going to bleed out on its own. Sometimes when it's wet like that you can manipulate the colour by just tipping the page, moving it around, and the pigment will then bleed back into the water in whatever direction that you tip your paper. Let's have a think, what else could we do? That has dried there. You can always come back in and overlay colour that way. But I think my favourite way to work is to wet the whole area first, and then I really like to drop the colour into the wet areas and just let it bleed and do its own thing. Now you have to be prepared doing it this way that there may be results that you just don't like. And you can always come back over and layer more watercolour, or you could use your coloured pencils to put some highlights in or shadows. You can always disguise bits that you don't like. You can always come back in, strengthen areas up with some more pigment. But I do like that, doing that process, and then using a contrasting colour usually, because you get a greater impact than just using a complementary colour. If you use a contrasting colour and then just let that bleed in, and the colours will do their own separation, their own blending. Now with practice, just blot some of that water because I've got a little bit too much there. And of course you can lift colour right off by doing that as well. By experimenting and playing with your materials, you'll find that some watercolour pencils, the pigment separates more than others. Some don't separate at all. And you'll also get varying results depending on the paper that you're using. So it's always recommended that you have a practice on a page that you're not particularly fond of, or if there are test pages at the back that you can have a play with, and just see how the paper reacts, how the pencils react to each other, and do some experimenting. And the longer that you keep doing it, you just find a way that works for you, and a way that the results more often than not is something that you're going to be happy with and that you like. Now with the watercolour pencils, when they're dry, you can also come back over those and put a little bit of extra colour on with the connector pens. You can also do the connector pens first and then perhaps get your watercolour pencils and go over the top of them and see what happens. So any of your water-based media are fun to just play with and see what kind of effects you can get from them. Now, another thing that I also like to do in the background is I'll get the background quite wet. And I'm just taking the colour off the pencil there. So just letting that bleed into the wet area. And then when it's very wet like that, the other thing that you can do is you need your brush quite wet. I've just dropped some water into there. You can see that it's pushing the pigment around. You can get your brush quite wet and then you can flick the end of the pencil and get some drops and some spray. You could use a toothbrush as well for this sort of thing. But you can see here where the paper was wet that those sprayed droplets are all going to blend. And what I'm going to do now, hopefully, is do the yellow with it as well. Now, if you don't want this to go all over your picture, the rest of the picture that you've spent lots of time colouring, you could mask all of this out by using a bit of tracing paper and cutting around the design, placing that over the top, and it acts as a shield. You could also try using watercolour masking fluid, and that will just protect your design from getting any splatter on it. I'm really quite lazy and a little bit impatient, so I don't really bother with that sort of thing very often, but I like to make the splatters all part of the effect. Okay, now while we're waiting for that to dry, I just thought I'd show you that I've also got one of these little tiny water palettes or paint palettes here with a bit of water in there, and you can also use your watercolour pencils in a way that's a bit more traditional, like a watercolour paint, and just keep getting some colour from the tip and make a bit of a wash like that. And then you can paint with it just like you would with a regular watercolour paint. And then you can just keep dropping some colour in there till you get sort of the desired effect. Now, I don't mind my paper getting really cockled or crinkled up with water, unless there's a design on the back that I really want to do. I'm quite willing to sacrifice some pages. Again, I would practice this with something that you're not really too concerned about the outcome, or a test page at the back if you're really worried about it. And then I'm just going to drop that into there. See if we can get this nice and wet. You might be able to see there where the yellow is actually pushing the green pigment aside. And you'll get some hard edges, or what they call hard edges. You may not like that effect, but I quite like it, so I'm happy to do that. And then I could also do some little, I don't know what you would call that, flicks or spraying. Okay, and I think that'll be enough for demonstration purposes. Excuse me. So I'll just try and lift this up carefully to show you. So you can see there that we've got lots of bleeding going on. I've got it very wet. I can manipulate things by tipping the page, letting it run. Now I'll just let that dry. And then at the end, when it's dry, if there is something that I really like with the random hard edges, I might actually emphasise that by using a bit of coloured pencil over the top of it. If there's something that you don't like, perhaps you could use a bit of coloured pencil to camouflage it or hide it. So what I might do now is let that dry and see how it comes out. And when this page is completed, I will probably post it onto Instagram. I'm Spare Room Studio on Instagram. And I think that will do for now. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments and I'll get back to you. And I'll say goodbye for now. Thank you. Bye.